Welcome to It's Like This podcast, your common sense mental and spiritual talk show. My name is Dr. Eugene Kim, a dual board certified psychiatrist from Texas. In this podcast, I explain mental and spiritual concepts with fun analogies, real stories, and positive message so you can not just survive, but thrive. My goal for you is to gain understanding, acceptance, and healing so that you can know your worth and live the life that you are meant to live. If you want that as much as I do, hit that subscribe button and let's listen to today's episode. In this episode, I present you a woman that continues to support and inspire me in my journey as a person and as a provider, Dr. Kirleen Neely. Dr. Neely has worked in the mental health field for over 25 years. She is a founder and CEO of Neely Behavioral Health in Texas, host of Drop the BS podcast, educator, researcher, counselor, and a public speaker. In this episode, Dr. Neely and I will talk specifically about your backstory. Dr. Neely is so passionate about you knowing your backstory in order to know yourself, find purpose and meaning in your life. She's so passionate that she created a course. We will talk about the importance of knowing your backstory, what kind of dysfunction could arise if you don't deal with your backstory, and lastly, how you can live a complete and full life by understanding and accepting your backstory. I am so excited for today's episode, so let's get started. Hey guys, welcome back to It's Like This podcast. I'm Dr. Eugene Kim, and we have a special guest, Dr. Kirleen Neely. And I'm just so inspired because, therapy and medications can work hand in hand. And she featured me as a doctor, but I want to feature her as kind of like a therapist who is really passionate about knowing your backstory. And I think that's what sets her apart. And she's been doing this. She has an online course. So welcome, Dr. Kirleen Neely. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. I am stoked and excited to be here. I can't wait to have the conversation.
Yeah. So just for my listeners, who is, not familiar with therapy and, what you do, tell me a little bit about what's going on right now in your life and what do you do with the backstory?
Sure. So from a business perspective, we have a private practice in San Antonio with a couple locations where we do kind of the traditional counseling and things like that. My office also has an EAP program where we provide counseling services to businesses and organizations. So basically, because I worked on my backstory, I get to do lots of really, really cool things. But my specialty more specifically is helping people understand how the stories that have happened to them, the things that have happened to them, how they translate those things into meaning and how that meaning shows up in their life and how they think and how they move and how they love and how they listen, just everything. So that word backstory, I keep thinking I should be sick of it by now, but I'm not, because I think it just layers everything we do.
I love that. And I caught that because I know my backstory, that affects what I do. And you not only mentioned like how you love and how you have relationship, but also your business having a meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, what makes me passionate is that, I'm a first generation immigrant. And so coming over, I was just very curious about how people lived and how they moved. I was just almost hypersensitive to it because I had a thick accent, got teased, bullied, the whole nine. And so I think it just put me in a position to look at story, to understand it. So from a business standpoint, me now getting to create space for diversity in story and allowing those diverse stories to be heard and understood, because I know my diverse story at one point wasn't heard and wasn't understood.
Wow. Yeah. And as an immigrant myself, I attract a lot of patients who are immigrants themselves. And it's just so awesome that I get to create that space for my patients as well. So that's kind of like how the backstory works. So, we all have backstories, sounds like. How did you formulate the idea, this is what it is? Like, how did that kind of pop up for you as a therapist?
Well, I think working over these 17 plus years, right? And the underlying theme of anybody that came in, whether they were working with depression or anxiety or, trying to work through a marriage, what I continue to see across board is that the experiences they had before this thing happened,
Mm-hmm.
whatever those experiences were, how mom talked to them, how if dad was available or not, what happened with their friends or their last boyfriend, those experiences, the story they were telling themselves was showing up in how they interacted now, how they
Yeah.
interacted with the anxiety or whatever. So I think it just continued to show up. And so for me, it was like, well, how do I take narrative really? Because it comes from an idea of narrative therapy. How do I
Yeah.
take that narrative? How do I put it in with some cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, some of the things that are a little more researched, and marry these two because a lot of the theories that I had been trained on was void
Yeah.
of the story. It was like, we're going to rewire the brain and we're going to teach them these techniques and these tools. And I'm like, well, where the hell is their story? Just looking at the fact that, yes, these are human beings and we want to be, very specific as we talk about certain things and we want to have, tools and techniques, but we also need to look at them as humans. And I could be using CBT with one person and it not work because they haven't dealt with their story. They haven't dealt with the pain. And I'm wondering, well, why are they learning these techniques? Why is this so hard? And when I dug deeper and allowed space to process, to heal, to deal with the inner child, whatever it was that they needed to do, then all of a sudden the techniques were like, okay, they could do those because they
Mm.
weren't carrying the baggage anymore.
It's interesting because CBT and DBT does have a lot of evidence, but I completely agree with little or much therapy exposure and training I got. It is like a snapshot, like of what's going on right now. Like, oh, you're having cognitive distortion. How to reframe that, like right here, right now. And it is effective. But I think what you're saying is the backstory is like the river that runs underneath and pops up in these ways. So let's just kind of ride the waves and go back to like how these cognitive distortions kind of came to place.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a saying, and I forgot who said this, but you cannot rise to a new level of consciousness without new information. And in order to
Mm.
rise to a new level of consciousness, which is what we want our patients to do, you have to be able to have new and look at things from a different perspective. You have to be able to go, oh gosh, so the reason why I'm so fearful of public speaking is
Mm.
because, when in fourth grade, I got up there and Johnny Matthews told me that I was, I couldn't speak and I had an irritating voice. And God,
Mm.
I didn't even know I was thinking about that still. Like, I don't think about that. Why? But processing it, then opens space to go, wow, I've been holding on to the story that I have an irritating voice.
Yeah, yeah. And and sometimes, why do you think people are hesitant to go explore their backstory?
Well, I mean, I think it's because it's hard. It's really easy to deal with the top surface because everybody wants a quick fix, right? We want to be able to,
Mm.
hey, I don't want to take a lot of time. And going back is painful because sometimes we all have wounds, even if you grow up in an amazing household, right? I don't care. I always say that we got to give our kids something to go to therapy for,
I
so you don't
hope
get to
my
be.
kids are listening to this with their
I know, right? And I always say, I wonder what my kids are going to go to therapy for. Because as a parent, we do lots of things. We say things, we address things. Kids are constantly interpreting. So at the end of the day, when those things, you have to go back and deal with those wounds, it's difficult. But it's so, so worth it because then you can move through your present in a different way because the past is not holding you.
Yeah. And it is painful. And I completely agree that everybody wants a quick fix. And sometimes there's two groups of patients that comes to me, for psychiatric evaluation. They just want a quick fix medication, just make me happy, just help me not deal with this. And the other ones are like scared to be, on meds for the fears. But it's just like the whole society is revolving around quick fixes in life and relationships, medications, happiness. It's overwhelming sometimes to kind of even take a time to breathe and just just think that you have a backstory. And that backstory was painful. So God forbid, like, I don't want to go there if I don't have to.
Yeah. And sometimes our backstories are beautiful, right? Even
Mm,
within the pain, because what I said before about making meaning of it, no matter what your backstory is, when you're able to really truly reframe it, to look at it from a perspective of resiliency, then it doesn't matter what it was. It could be maybe a dad who abandoned you. It could be anything. You can make meaning of it because we do rise from our backstories. It's not always a negative, and I think we need to stress that to people, that sometimes you have to go back to go forward.
yeah. And there's something to be said that without going back, you will never make sense of it and you'll never rise above it. You'll never heal from it if you don't revisit the past and the story. I know from personal experience, it does take a lot of time. Like, you have to respect the aspect of time and aspect of hard work, carrying those wounds again. And I think that's why I do emphasize maybe you need a therapist and a professional to do it with you.
Absolutely. I think that a lot of people, what I see when I start to do backstory work is a lot of people feel like I've dealt with that. Like, I've dealt with it. I'm good.
Mm,
And so sometimes it's hard to get them to see the need for it. But when we do start to process, it's not that they haven't dealt with it. They may have addressed it, but our backstories, I like to say, are tricky and controlling. They developed out of a defense mechanism to protect us, right? Maybe we go into fight or flight mode a lot when, we're triggered, or we shut down. Some people, a relationship standpoint, they may give more than they're getting because they feel like in order to be loved, I need to be the giver. I need to be whatever the story is. And
mm-hmm.
so, a lot of times when we engage in those things, it's hard and difficult for people. But ultimately, on the other side, they end up realizing that, wow, I get the connection now in a bigger and a better way. So it can't show up the same way anymore. They're like, okay, there it is. There's my backstory. I see it. That's the trigger. That's a distortion happening right there. Now I can pivot and I can use those tools because I'm so much more aware of how it shows up.
You mentioned some of the ways that the backstory shows up, and even though we can pinpoint, oh, that's from my past, it kind of comes up in a very repetitive, cycling, dysfunctional way. And you mentioned, like, disproportion of give and take in a relationship. Can you kind of explain to the readers, like, or listeners, like, how else would, you know, might might make you think like, oh, I think I have an issue and I think I need to revisit my backstory. Like, what would be the symptoms to look out for?
Sure. So I like to say that, your backstory shows up in 5 kind of predictable ways, right? 5 patterns, right? So depending on how you're triggered or what your trigger is or whatever it is, for a lot of people, when this feeling, and it's a familiar feeling, it's a feeling that you had at another point. And so sometimes you disconnect, the feeling, you feel it. It's visceral when you feel it, but you're not making the connection that, oh, that's when I failed out of college. That's the feeling or whatever. So it shows up in kind of that traditional fight or flight, okay, maybe it's time for me to try out for a promotion. I need to go interview. So I start talking myself out of it. No, you know what? They probably want somebody else. Like, what do I have to offer? All those things like that. In other people, I see them where from a relationship standpoint, they shut down. They're not able to, if there's a fight, if there's confrontation, they curl in, right? And they curl up and they're like, I don't know why I can't get my words out when it's time for us to like have this conversation. And making the connection that, oh, because, when you were a kid, being heard was not what happened in your house. So now when you need to be heard again, you turn into the little kid, you turn into the 6-year-old who can't get their words out. As mentioned before, I see this one a lot, giving more than you're getting in relationships, feeling that based on who I am and what I have to offer, that if I am not the giver, the doer, the one who is, oh yeah, I'll volunteer for the PTA, or, no, you watch the football game. I'll make dinner, take care of all the kids and whatever it is.
Yeah.
The other behavior that I see is what I like to call hiding bad behavior. And hiding bad behavior means to me that kind of minimizing when people hurt you, minimizing when they wrong you, and sometimes even hiding your own bad behavior, not being willing to recognize that how I treated X, Y, and Z, how I talked in that moment wasn't good. Almost kind of, minimizing what was done to you and what you've done. And then the last behavior that I see a lot is what I like to call kind of, and it really has to do with cognitive distortions, kind of just that whole thinking paralysis, over analyzing, reading the email 10 times, revisiting a conversation. Well, why did Dr. Kim say that? I wonder if she said it because of this. I wonder if this, so these are some predictable patterns of behavior that I see. Of course, there's lots of other ones that doesn't encompass everything, but just to give people a snapshot. So we look at those behaviors. Let me back up. We deal with the undercurrent of the backstory. We process the pain, the wounds, the good, the bad. We make the connection to how that story shows up in these behaviors. Do you go into fight or flight mode? Do you isolate and shut down? Do you give more than you're getting? Do you hide or minimize bad behavior? Do you do the thinking paralysis? We make the connection there, and then we start to teach them a process to every time you're triggered, this is the process, and we can talk about that process a little bit more.
Yeah. So, and as you're describing, these are all kind of dysfunctional, inappropriate response to what's going on, like exactly like minimizations. You're minimizing trauma, like what happened, or abuse or neglect. And also it makes you minimize the effects, like the negative effects that you have on people, the trauma that you might be causing, or the abuse and neglect that you might be causing. And it's all because of the backstories of what happened. And something that if the listeners are listening and you're like, that is me, or I think I do that. I just want to encourage the listeners that you're in a really good spot if you can point that out. If you can be humble enough to listen to this podcast and be like, that might be me. You're actually in a very soft-hearted, humble spot. And, because a lot of times when I talk to patients, a lot of times I talk about their backstory from their childhood, and they cry, and they all say, I did not expect myself to cry, but I don't know why, but they feel seen and heard unexpectedly, so I just want to encourage our listeners, if you're thinking oh man, I feel very seen and heard, this is a really sweet spot that I'm just glad that our listeners can process right now.
Yeah, I am smiling and vibing off of what you said, because as I start to do work like this with people, that is exactly what I hear too. They are talking about it, and all of a sudden they're like, why am I crying? Why? And so our body stores these things, right? And so it's on a very subconscious level, but it affects us consciously, and we're not aware of it, but not until we give space.
Yes.
Why would they cry? Why would talking about something elicit so much emotion if it doesn't matter? So that alone lets us know how the stories and the things that happen to us, they are still traveling like a time traveler. They're just traveling with you. You just need to be aware of it. You can't change it. But the awareness, you're able to do something with it once you have the awareness and the tools, of course.
Right. And you're exactly right. Why would you be crying if it doesn't matter? Do you know how much? And it's just we live in a society, and maybe some of the cultures that we grew up in is we just have to get stronger, and stronger and stronger, and just beat ourselves up. And then our body's just telling us, I'm tired of carrying this. Can we just do something about it?
Yeah. And, the other thing is culturally, right? We talked about both being immigrants. I think culturally, as my parents came over, it was about a better future for us. We're going to work hard. You're already an immigrant, all these things. And so there was no space for emotion.
Yeah.
There was no space for feelings. And for me, I think that's why I picked up on it, because I was a little kid with lots of emotion. I was feeling everything, and there was no place to put it. So I think I said, well, let me just understand feelings better, since I don't have the avenue to, let my feelings out. I'll just understand other people's feelings better.
That's awesome. And, and that kind of speaks volume to when we grow up in a household where our parents didn't create that space, maybe unintentionally or intentionally, they were not able to, create that space. We all grow up maybe thinking, and the message from the world to us is that your backstory doesn't matter, shouldn't matter, or probably doesn't matter. You're functioning well now, so why does it matter? All these kind of doubts kind of come. So I think it's really important that if you're listening to this podcast or recognizing that you have these dysfunctional patterns and the therapist kind of create that safe space for you, it might be the first time that we ever get to talk about our backstory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the other thing I want to say is that this doesn't mean we all have a story, we all have a backstory. It doesn't mean you're not successful. It doesn't mean you're not a rock star at your job or kicking butt or whatever. But I also know that even some of the most successful people that I've worked with, they'll tell me, they have imposter syndrome, or they're still, yes, I'm over here doing, I'm a lawyer and I'm in this big courtroom talking to these attorneys, but, my heart is beating out my chest because the back of my head, I'm thinking they're going to find out I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. And so when we're able to connect, well, where does that come from, and connect that story, we're able to help them move through it in a different way.
Yeah. And, you mentioned like processing these things. What are the steps of, if you can kind of touch on it briefly, the process of understanding your backstory?
So, I think there's a couple of things I like doing. For instance, I'll usually do a quick assessment in terms of an adverse childhood experience, right? That's a, quick 10 questionnaire thing. So we'll look at that first, right? Let's look at what are some of those things. And, a lot of times people will say, oh, I had a really great childhood. I didn't have anything, my parents were great. And then we'll do the questionnaire and some things will start popping up on there that they're like, well, I didn't think about that. And it's, Dr. Kim, now they're looking at adverse childhood experiences and even like bullying, and some things are being added to it that weren't there before. And so we start there as a layer to start exploring that story. One of the things I love making people do also is some sort of a timeline where they start to look at those different sections of their life and us pull out some pieces to explore. So we'll do it from that standpoint first. Once we're able to identify, these are the stories, these are the themes is really what we're looking for. Maybe a theme of rejection, a theme of I'm afraid of disappointing people, so I'm a people pleaser, whatever the themes, we extract the themes. And then we go into a deeper processing. And there I like to do what's called inner child work, where I have the patient almost talk to that other part of themselves and heal that inner child. Tell that inner child that they are safe, that they are loved, that they are seen, that they are heard, that I got this at this point. You don't have to keep showing up. You don't have to keep popping up and making me scared or anxious or whatever it is. It's a powerful ceremony. And then after that, we usually move into them doing something symbolic, something tangible. So sometimes people will do a balloon release, or they might plant a tree, something symbolic with their hands to show this is me reclaiming my story. This is me releasing it into the universe, into the world in whatever way that is healthy and productive for them. So that's some of the work we do when we're trying to really uncover and dig.
Yeah, and I'm just like nodding along too, because that's like, I do a mini version of that in my office too, where I tell my patients, talk to your little Eugene, talk to your little Kirleen right now, and I make them do it in session. And of course it's awkward, to talk to yourself like little Eugene, like you're heard, you're seen. But I almost like encourage them to talk to yourself like a third person, like, and I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, it is, because we all have that part, right? When you think about like as an adult, we, some of the behaviors we engage in, right? We know better. Like cognitively, I know that I should not give more than I'm getting. I know that. But why am I engaging in it? And what I talk about is that it's that little version of yourself that's like, oh, love me, love me, love me. Oh, like me, or whatever it is. And so being able to heal that little Eugene, little Kirleen, and let them know big Kirleen has it. I have it under control. Trust me. I can take care of you. There really is a transition that needs to happen.
It's almost like I like the word. It seems like you're parenting your inner child's needs, so that it'd be like, I got you, and I will get you, and you can trust. So it's like almost letting that inner child trust you and like reparent yourself. If you weren't parented, up until this point, this is why you have dysfunctions, but I'm going to parent you now.
Exactly. And you use the exact word. It is the reparenting. Whether you had parents or didn't have parents or had parents who didn't know. I think most people's parents just did what they knew how to do. It wasn't because they wanted to hurt the child or harm the child.
Mm,
They just did what was done to them. But
hmm.
now it is our job to parent ourselves and not show up in these ways anymore.
And like talking about parenting and reparenting ourselves, I think it is so powerful when we do that because you mentioned like knowing your backstory gives you meaning. And for me, knowing my backstory gave me meaning as a mom, so I knew that if I did what my previous generation did, I'll just continue the cycle of dysfunction. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to reparent myself so that I don't continue this generational cycle of dysfunction to my kids. And I think maybe if you can touch on that, like that's how I received meaning and in my role as a mom. And what are other ways that people can find meaning, through understanding their backstory?
Yeah, so I want to tap on this first because this is really good. I think
Mm-hmm.
what you said is what we want to see happen, right? You understand your story, you reparent yourself. But and most people I think go into things thinking that. Like when they have kids, they think I'm not going to do what my mom and dad did. I'm not going to
Mm.
do this, I'm not going to do that. And they're aware that they want to do something different, but because they haven't done their work, what they to me do sometimes is they go to the extreme. So if the
Yeah.
parent wasn't maybe the parent didn't have enough money to buy you the best clothes. All of a sudden, I'm way over here buying everything.
Oh, yes. I see that all the time.
Yes. And so that's what I mean by really understanding your story, right? If you just understand it on a very top level, that's what you're going to do. You're just going to make an
Mm.
adjustment and you're going to go in the opposite direction. But the opposite
Hmm.
direction often is not necessarily what the child needs. You've created a whole other issue.
Yeah.
Um, so I hope I just had to get back in there
No, because that swinging to the other side is still rooted in insecurity of not knowing your backstory, right? So if you're insecure, you'll always go back and forth. And guess what? Your kid, if they're insecure, they're gonna do the other opposite. Like my
Yes.
parents always bought me like Burberry's and like Louis Vuitton, so now I'm gonna make them so cheap. Like
Yes.
generation will always swing and overcorrect if we really don't understand and be grounded. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. So I'll see, even like I'll have somebody that they're bringing a family's coming in, and one of the things that's happening is the mom is smothering the child, right? They got to be on top
Mm-hmm.
of everything, and the child is at that teenage years where they're like, "Mom, you don't trust me," and so they're having a lot of conflict. When I start to look at the mother's backstory and help her explore it, she grew up in a home where there was no touch, there was no love, there was
Mm-hmm.
no, and so she taught to herself, well, when I have a kid, I'm going to make sure they know I love them. I'm going to love them all the time. I'm going to kiss them all the time, swinging the pendulum, not realizing.
Mm-hmm.
And now she's going, well, what am I doing wrong? I thought I was
Mm-hmm.
doing everything right. And so our backstories are tricky and controlling, and they find a way to show up. And so once you understand them, you're able to make more of a neutral, balanced decision about how you'll engage with that story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and then we just kind of parked here because once it's like trying to find meaning without work makes you forget and overcorrect and do it wrong again. So it's like you need to do the work, and that is so important to find that shades of gray that you should go not swinging from black and white. Now, what? So I really, when I became a mom, I just had like a new life, like new motivation. And I think a lot of people find it true that when you have a child on your own, you start to have new motivation to change that. What are some other ways that you found people finding meaning by understanding their backstory?
So, I think, of course, there's these tangible things like, you're a parent, so you do something different, just like you're
Mm-hmm.
doing. I think the meaning really comes in seeing themselves. Like a lot of times we walk through the world not seeing ourselves, like almost a zombie to a certain extent, not really being able to look in the mirror and say, I like the person I see. I see
Mm.
me. I can look in her eyes. So I think one of the biggest overarching things I see as people explore their backstory that comes up is that they begin to like who they see in the mirror. They're able to look at all of the wrinkles and how the eyes are shaped and the neck and all those things, and see that this woman in front of them or man in front of them has a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful story. They're able to kind of take themselves in fully and
Mm.
wholly in a different way, if that makes sense to you, Dr.
Yeah, yeah. And there's an episode about intuitive eating, and it's like intuitive eating is just like separating yourself from culture of diets and disordered eating, and you're really appreciating you as who you are, not based on maybe relating to this case what your backstory was telling you, what your parents are telling you, what your society is telling you. And I like what you're saying, because you're appreciating and accepting yourself, and maybe like to a degree of impressed with yourself, like, wow, like you went through all of that and you are here today. And sometimes, like, and as a role of a psychiatrist and therapist, like you hear back people's backstory and they're still down on themselves. I have to be first the positive voice, be like, do you understand like what you just went through? And you're still trying to be a good mom, or like you're still like trying to function as a human being. That's amazing. And they're like, first it doesn't stick because it's like awkward. But like the more that I encourage them, you're like, you're right. Like my backstory is pretty significant and I'm still here trying to do my best. And I think people get impressed like with themselves, which is a first.
Yeah, words have power, and the words you tell yourself. One of the thing about the backstory is that it is rooted in a lot of self-talk. How it
Mm,
continues to show up in your life is that there is a little voice in your head that is constantly saying things. And so when that backstory is saying you're broken, if anybody knew that you went through this, if anybody knew you had been molested, if anybody knew whatever, when that
mm,
little voice is telling that story, you always move in a place of insecurity. When that
yeah,
little boy voice is saying, girl, do you know what you went through? And look at how you came through it. You move differently. And so
yeah,
reframing that story is extraordinarily important.
yeah. And I think we talked about in your podcast of like having a mental health team, like for you. But what I like in this podcast episode is the importance of addressing your backstory and how the backstory talks to you, so that your backstory can be part of your mental health team, like inside your head.
Yeah, you know what? You're giving me something new there. Yeah, I like that.
Invite me for your next podcast.
Yes, yes, yes. You'll hear that show. And I think the other thing is, so once you process all of these things like that, I always say that you then all of that's great and we do all the processing, but we are living in the today moment. And so
Mm,
the backstory work is not just about going backwards and just backwards. It's about understanding the backwards and past and then moving to the today. So we then do a lot of work on, what do we do right now? And you're talking about some of that reframing. I usually
mm,
start out talking about a bottom up approach, that in order for us to be able to use the tools we're going to work on, you have to make sure that you're grounded in your body, that there's some sort of maybe some meditation happening, something to calm yourself, that you're aware of when you're triggered, because awareness is the key. You can't change anything unless you go, okay, so when my heart starts beating fast like that, every time I'm in this meeting with this guy over here, it's because he overtalks me. And when he overtalks me, it feels like when my brother used to overtalk me. And
mm,
and
mm.
I shut down when he overtalks me. And why am I doing? Okay, you know what? The next time I'm going to take that breath. I'm going to breathe through it. I'm going to say, you have it. You got it. Stand up for yourself. And I'm going to speak out this time. And so that's a real
Mm.
practical in the moment. That's how our backstories show up. The girl's in the meeting and she's like, why do I shut down in this meeting? I'm smart as these guys, but it's because they're over talking her, again, connected to the brother that used to.
Yeah, yeah. Reframing, and I also like teasing apart, like that guy is not your brother. It's like it's not the same guy. And a lot of times we have our body reaction by triggers that look similar, but it's like telling our body, hey, it's a different situation and you have control in this situation, unlike in the last situation when you were a little girl and your brother was bigger than you, you didn't have control, but right now you do because you're an adult.
Absolutely. So, I tell people, bottom up first,
Mm,
settle the body down, neutralize the thought next.
Yeah.
by reframing whatever you need to do, neutral thought, not the extreme thought, and then state your truth. Positive affirmation for yourself, self-kindness. I have this. You are intelligent. You have everything that you need. You are prepared. You are capable. Say what you need to say. And so just that simple 3-step process, bottom up, neutralize the thought, state the truth.
I like that. And I like simplifying it like that because I mean, let's be honest, like mental health is blowing up and there's just so many thoughts and ideas. And I think it could get overwhelming for people.
Yeah, because, there's stuff coming from everywhere. And, I think the thing about mental health that people struggle with is that, what works for Dr. Kim may not work for Kirleen, may not work for whatever. So you have to find your sweet spot. And I encourage people, don't give up. What I'm talking about is one way. It's not the way. It's not, but if you're somebody who likes processing, they like understanding, they like making connections, they like being able to look at themes, and they want to do the work, then I think the process that I use is something that could be very helpful.
Yeah. So at this point, if we were to wrap it up and if you had like few minutes with our listeners who are just being awoke to this idea, maybe I have a backstory and maybe that was an explanation why I'm having these patterns of dysfunctional relationships or, low self-esteem or anxiety. Like, what would you want our listeners to know?
I would want them to know that whatever it is they went through matters, that the experiences that they have shape them, but those experiences also probably show up in ways that maybe don't serve them, that it's no time like the present, that it's not too late, you're not too old, whatever it is that you're thinking in your head, seek help, seek a professional to be able to help you to explore this. Therapists, psychiatrists, we all are trained. I have packaged this in a way, but there's nothing that I'm talking about that other therapists can't use and put together in their own way. But today is the day. Don't wait. Your story continues, and it continues if you are able to have more tools to do better with it.
Yeah, that's really good. So if they're like, you know what, Dr. Neely, I'm ready to move forward and I want to work with you, how can people find you?
Absolutely. So on social media, you can find me at Dr. Kirleen. I usually like to hang out on Instagram and Facebook. You can also go to my website, which is neelycounseling.com. That's NEELY counseling.com.
And, I'm going to put all this information in the description box. So if you are interested in the work that she does, and I believe that online course will be available on your website as well, right?
Yeah. We're super excited. We've been revamping it and working it and hoping that the course is going to launch or relaunch again sometime in November, for sure. So go to the site, you can save your seat and you'll get some information about that. So it's going to be a really good course. It's a hybrid course we're doing this time. So there's 8 video-based learning sessions that you're going to do where you go through the process I'm talking about. And then you're going to do a live coaching with me where you get to actually be with me and we talk about the process. You ask questions. So I'm happy that I'm going to get to connect with people. It's not just going to be online. It's also going to be where we connect face to face.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Neely, thank you so much for your time. I wish we could talk forever because I really like our energy. And it's just like, it's really amazing how therapists and psychiatrists, we can just work together and just bring different expertise, but we're actually saying the same thing. Absolutely. Like your story matters, it's worth exploring. It takes a lot of work, but understanding that it's going to be more like true to who you actually are, and ground yourself so that you can move forward in a very powerful way.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I really hope that you enjoyed the collaboration with Dr. Neely and I. And I just, in summary, it's like this, right? There's a theme of security in knowing yourself and trust in knowing yourself and feeling safe because you can trust yourself. And I think through therapy, through community, through just creating that safe space within yourself, I just hope that you are brave and courageous to explore your backstory. And if you need a professional to do it, there's no shame. We all do. And that is the best way to explore your backstory. I hope you really enjoyed the collaboration. If you have anyone that you want me to interview and collaborate with, please write down in the comments below or review, or just email me at restorePsychiatrymd@gmail.com. So thank you so much for your participation, and I'll definitely see you in the next episode.